Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Executive Director, William Wolfe. It's been a while since we've been live or released an episode, but we have such important issues to discuss in the Southern Baptist Convention, particularly related to the ongoing debate over the nature and the outcome of the so-called quote unquote abuse crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention. This is something that has been talked about for over 6 years now, with a lot of revelations that have confirmed the concerns of many faithful, Bible-believing, people-loving Southern Baptists who were concerned that this was a false narrative and that as a denomination, we were being led down a disastrous path by power-hungry actors who had hidden or not so hidden agendas to wrest control of this largest Protestant denomination in America under essentially a Me Too rubric and ideology. And recent revelations in one of the continuing cases that is still ongoing in the courts between David Sills and the Southern Baptist Convention, a massive document dump has confirmed many of those who said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Many of those people, including my two guests today, Megan Basham and John Whitehead, and many others, Tom Buck, Tom Askell, Mike Stone, many others, were horrifically attacked as being those trying to provide cover for abusers and rape apologists and other absurd and slanderous claims like that. And yet time and time again, as the truth comes out, which God promises us that it will, they have been proven right. And the Me Too activists with their agenda have been proven wrong. And Southern Baptists are wondering why we are left holding the bag on what is now a cost of over $15 million spent on these investigations and these reports, resulting in the current sale of the SBC headquarters, many good names ruined, when we should have just stuck with biblical justice and biblical principles in the first place. So joining me today are Megan Basham and John Whitehead. They'll be up here shortly. I'm going to play our intro and we'll be back. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this link. If you're a Southern Baptist, make sure to send it to your pastor, send it to your friends, send it to your local associations, your state associations. We need Southern Baptists to know the truth because we're Christians. We are Christians and the truth matters. We'll be right back here in a moment.
Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
John, Megan, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you guys doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. And I apologize for the hat. This is kind of my Friday, so I'm casual Fridaying over here.
No problem. John did not go with a hat, neither did I, but that's okay. Let's go. Megan and John, just go ahead and introduce yourselves. I think most people know you are, but for those who don't, as we always hope to have new listeners, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, I'm Megan Basham. I am a cultural reporter at the Daily Wire. You can find me several times a week, usually on our Morning Wire news podcast, and frequently doing regular reports like the one we're going to talk about today. And I also had a best-selling book in 2024, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda.
And I'm John Whitehead. I'm a lawyer just outside Kansas City, Missouri. Most of my practice involves churches and religious groups and First Amendment issues. And I'm a member of the advisory board at CBL, and I've been a longtime Baptist and active in the convention.
And a former trustee at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Former trustee at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, amongst many other positions.
I think maybe you've joined us once before since you've now become former, but you had a really important perch there, particularly related to some of these issues we're going to talk about today.
It relates to this. I've told folks it was a providential placement that let me see a lot of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and so we're back having this conversation again today about the abuse crisis, so-called abuse crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention, a narrative that's gone on for at least 6 years now, if not more, because of a recent article at Baptist News Global. No friends of mine, no friends of Megan. I don't know how they feel about John Whitehead. Everybody likes John, which explored court records, particularly in the David Sills case. And that was released on December 8th, 2025. It included access to a lot of, I guess, previously unpublished court records that showed us a lot, gave us a lot of insight into this case. And this case is really important because it's a so-called linchpin case in the Guidepost Guidepost Solutions investigative report. So let's start with Megan and then John. Mm-hmm. Megan, give us a little bit of the history. Why are we here today? And why have, for the last 2 weeks, Southern Baptists been still talking about this case and these issues in our convention?
Yeah, well, starting back in 2019, abuse, I would say, really became a weapon, the narrative of abuse that was wielded by Russell Moore against some internal enemies that he had at the executive committee. That year, he sort of abruptly announced that he was going to be changing the theme of the fall ERLC conference. I think it was originally missions related, but I don't remember. But he abruptly said, no, we're going to do abuse now. We're going to do the Caring Well conference. And he welcomed Rachel Den Hollander to be the keynote speaker at that. And on the platform, they had previously discussed that she was going to lambaste the executive committee for allegedly mistreating a survivor who had come to them. So that survivor was Jennifer Lyle. The quick background on her case is that she was a 26-year-old master's student at Southern Seminary when she got involved in some sort of sexual entanglement with Professor David Sills, who was 23 years her senior. So, we have an older professor, but we also have an adult at 26 years old. So they got involved for the 2 years that she was on campus. They were involved. And then their relationship continued for another 10 years after she left Southern Seminary and went on to become a publishing executive and editor with first Moody Bible Publishing and with Lifeway. And in both of those institutions, she continued to contract books from David Sills and to have a relationship with him. Well, she had come forward at the height of the Me Too movement in 2018, and she had gone to her bosses at Lifeway and to Dr. Albert Mohler at Southern Seminary and claimed that the entire 12 years, it was never consensual, that it was always violent sexual assault and abuse, that there was absolutely no consent from her. She never wanted that. So a strange story that I think most reasonable people, given that she lived in different states and had to travel to meet with him, would initially have some questions going, well, this is a little different than what you typically expect when you're talking about abuse cases. How the executive committee got involved was that she then wanted to tell her story to the Baptist press. So, this was a moment, again, this was when Me Too was roiling in all of our, major cultural institutions. It was happening in Hollywood. It was in all of our newspapers. And I remember seeing a memo somewhere from someone at the Baptist press who said, we need to speak to this moment. So Jennifer Lyle's story was the way they were going to speak to this moment. But, the attorneys on the executive committee very rightly looked at the story and went, well, wait a minute. Is she alleging that he was physically violent with her in some way? Was this emotional abuse? She wasn't a child. It doesn't look like. What exactly is she alleging? Because she had never clarified that. And so with concern for that, since no one had talked to David Sills and she had never filed any police reports or brought forward any charges or anything like that, they said, okay, let's phrase it in the story that we're going to publish in the Baptist press as a morally inappropriate relationship, but we will let her comment. And then in quoting her, they allowed her to frame it as abuse. So sort of, split the difference. Well, at that point, Rachel Den Hollander was Lyle's representative, her attorney. She was very unhappy. Lyle was very unhappy that they used that phrasing, morally inappropriate relationship. And so they said that was the mistreatment that the executive committee had perpetrated against Jennifer Lyle. And so they paid her $1 million, in my purview, just to make the bad press go away. Because, after Russell Moore brought Rachel Den Hollander onto the stage, it created a storm of bad press. And I think they just wanted it to quiet down. So, that's a lot of background information, but that's how this started.
Okay, let me unpack that for a second and then turn it over to John. So on the timeline, the Lyle story case breaks before the Houston Chronicles article?
No.
Well, okay.
It's
okay.
not
Yeah, I would
reported.
say I don't remember.
It does break at Baptist Press after the Chronicle story. The Chronicle story was February 10, 2019.
Okay.
And then the Lyle resignation was then, I think, in June. So it was just right after that.
Okay. So
the Sills resignation. Yeah.
So the Houston Chronicles report that, what was 40 years of thousands of cases of abuse, primarily talking about children, right? Like that's what it focused on. Like
right.
They tried to paint it as if the Southern Baptist Convention was this, this den of child predators. That was the framing of the Houston Chronicles report. And so then Lyle, a grown woman, comes forward in public with this affair that she's been having with David Sills. And Rachel was hired to be her attorney before or after or around when she was being platformed by the ERLC. Do we know the timeline on that?
My understanding is that Rachel decided to represent Lyle right after she spoke at the ERLC conference that year. So in fall of 2019, my understanding is she talked about Lyle from the platform and then immediately initiated this lawsuit again. Well, and it wasn't a lawsuit. It was just a threat of a lawsuit against the executive committee.
Yeah. And I think somebody testified that it was Dr. Moeller that had brought Rachel into the situation and that had established contact with Jen and with Southern. So as early as 2018-ish, Rachel has some connection, is introduced to Jen at least, and here's that story.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important as just a lay member in the Southern Baptist Convention and not a lawyer, that we are establishing a clear fact of a conflict of interest from the earliest days. So, John, over to you as a lawyer. Rachel is being brought in as a lawyer. She's a lawyer to represent Lyle and engage on this to defend Lyle's interests, not the interests of the executive committee, not the interest of Southern Seminary, not the interests of, you see where I'm going with this, not the interests of the Southern Baptist Convention, but the interests of Jennifer Lyle. John, does that create a conflict of interest from the very beginning?
Yeah, certainly. The one of the underlying things that comes out and is made more clear in the filings that have been put on record recently is this question of conflict of interest. Can one person wear all the hats of representing Jen Lyle, of representing Hannah Kate Williams, of representing other victims, of making referrals to other attorneys and co-counseling on those cases. So you're representing victims. Can you wear that hat at the same time you're advising the Southern Baptist Convention on how to respond to those issues, on how to investigate those issues, on the scope of the reports? And then I think at some way halfway through, the story changes from what they expected it to be, and that raises all kinds of new questions, because now the convention is investigated by a Guidepost, and I think the worst thing they expected, what they expected was worse, and it didn't. And at that point, the conflicts really come into play, because now we've got a story that nobody expected at the beginning. And wearing all of those hats, are you giving undivided loyalty to each of those clients, each of those people you're trying to help? And that's very hard to do appropriately in under the law.
But Megan, back to what you said. So with how Baptist Press handled it and the executive committee initially, sounds reasonable to me that they're not going to go on record and side with Lyle against Southern Seminary, against the Southern Baptist Convention. That Rachel got $1 million out of them for Lyle just off of that story, like right at the outset.
Yeah, I mean, that's surprising. What I think, as I said, is I think that if you remember, it was coming off of her Larry Nassar testimony, which was incredibly heroic and moving. And I think so many people admired her at that time. And she had become the face of trying to stop abuse within church circles. And so I think there was a feeling that if Rachel Den Hollander has turned her eyes on you, you really just want to make that kind of pressure go away. And so, that was my sense. What I have been told, I interviewed members of the executive committee at that time, and they told me that the insurance company actually didn't want to settle this case, that they thought that Jennifer Lyle really had no suit and there's no chance she would win in court. And so they didn't want to settle it. But some of the leadership at the time, I think I've heard Ronnie Floyd just kind of went, look, just give it to her and make her go away, except obviously that didn't work. And then the other piece of this I do want to highlight, because so much of this will focus on Jennifer Lyle. And that's an interesting question in itself. If we're talking about protecting children from being abused, how did so much of the conversation come to surround these adult women? And so two things I want to say about that. One, the original Houston Chronicle reporting was presented as a bombshell, but really what it was just collating a lot of local news stories that had already been adjudicated. There had already been charges. In some cases, people were already sent to jail. So what Robert Downen and the other reporters with that Abuse of Faith series did was essentially go back more than 20 years over, the roughly 47,000 Southern Baptist churches and find anything they could that was related to abuse in a Southern Baptist church. It didn't necessarily have to be a pastor or a staff member. It didn't even necessarily have to occur in connection with the church. If you had someone who was a Southern Baptist going to a church at that time and abused a child and was arrested for it, they were also put into that number. So essentially, it was a collation of a lot of local news reports. And what people need to understand about that is that the Southern Baptist Convention is a voluntary association. So the national leadership had no control over, who the pastor was at these churches, had no control over staffing or how they handled things. So really, this was a question of saying, your local church, you need to go to your local elders, go to your local police. So their stance wasn't we're ignoring abuse. It was we have no mechanism to respond to these claims, or so these allegations need to go to the proper authorities and not to us. That was their stance. And then when the Houston Chronicle and other outlets claimed there was a cover-up of abuse by the national leadership, that was never true either. So if I can explain what they meant by cover-up, a staffer on the executive committee, when this debate was going on over whether we can create a database or whether we can create some structure by which we now would have authority over churches, a staff member did basically what the Houston Chronicle did, set a Google alert for anything that would be a local story connecting a Southern Baptist pastor, staff, church member to abuse in some way, and then just started making a list of these news stories. So it was all public information. All this staffer had done was collate it into a list. And the executive committee had not published or publicly released that already public information. And that was what was being called a cover-up, which, I don't know how you cover up already public information.
Yeah, so that's really important. So there's the false claim of a cover up because they're aggregating public information. And then there's essentially a false and weaponized claim that they mistreat a so-called survivor, and that was Jennifer Lyle, correct? Was there anybody else that they were claiming that the executive committee mistreated during the beginning stages of all of this?
Well, I don't know that it was a claim of mistreatment, and it was actually somewhat outside of the purview of what Guidepost was tasked with. But the story of Johnny Hunt also came up, having some sort of it's a little unclear. It wasn't, sexual intercourse. There was an interlude between him and a pastor's wife who the Hunts were friendly with, a woman in her mid 30s. And she claimed later, after 10 years of therapy, she said she came to see it as assault and abuse. She didn't see it that way at first. So after much therapy, 10 years later, she decided that this groping, kissing session that she had with Johnny Hunt was abuse and assault and not, in opening stage of an adultery, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is really important because I'm trying to help our listeners understand, if they're tuning back into this, like how this whole ball got rolling and the steps along the way where we were fed, frankly, a false narrative. And I titled this this stream "Woke and Weaponized" on purpose, not just for shock value. The woke part is the Me Too ideology. That just fundamentally where the Southern Baptist Convention and at the time, actually, it was people who weren't so much in charge, but who were trying to be in charge, who glommed on to, frankly, this unbiblical understanding of justice and used it to gain power. And that's the weaponized part. They weaponized this woke ideology to gain power in the Southern Baptist Convention and slander and throw everybody under the bus who would dare to have the courage to say, let's stop and think about this from a biblical perspective or even from a reasonable legal perspective, which resulted in the entire executive committee essentially being overthrown and filled with Russell Moore acolytes and activists, which is where I want to go to next, John. So as these things are going down the line, Houston Chronicles, which tries to paint, this perception of the Southern Baptist Convention as being a den of child abuse, looking at, as Megan spelled out, old cases, just aggregating public information. That was the impetus that people like Russell Moore, J.D. Greer, Grant Gaines, Philip Bethencourt, feel free to name anybody else you want to, because we're naming names here because Southern Baptists need to know. They used it as a power play, and you saw some of this happen from your position at the ERLC. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So, I guess one thing I think would be helpful for people is background. What is the story on here? And I guess one thing personally, my childhood church blew up over an accusation not too dissimilar from some of this. This was 2004, before the Me Too movement. But in my local church, we had a youth minister or singles minister that entered a relationship with a young woman, and she sued later, and there was a child that was born out of that, and she sued and said she'd been assaulted, and in that case, I did see the church pushed back and said, no, the minister did nothing wrong. The minister should stay in his place because it was all the woman's fault. She came on to him, and so he can be forgiven. He can stay in his place. And that to me seemed wrong. And I've written, in fact, for CBL, I think the first thing I wrote for CBL along with Josh Abatoy was a statement that a pastor's sexuality does matter. So I do think there have been cases in SBC life when people have tried to excuse the behavior of pastors and say, well, they can come back into ministry. And so I want it to be clear that when pastors engage in adultery, whether consensual or abusive or however you want to describe it, they lose their right to be a pastor from then on. There is no restoration of ministry in my mind. So that's where I'm coming from on these issues. At the same time, there is a kind of woke theory of sin, right? Somebody's called social justice a theory of harmatology, a sin, an alternative to the Christian theory. And so under that theory, if there's any power imbalance, then even consensual sexual conduct becomes rape. And I've always drawn the line there, right? Child or sexual abuse, I think to most people, clearly covers the case when somebody uses violence to obtain sex or has sexual relationships with minor children who can't consent. Those are clear cases of sexual abuse. But there's this kind of competing theology, competing sociology that says, well, as long as there's a power imbalance, then we can't hold that person responsible at all for their conduct. And that's always been in some conflict with what I think historical Christian teaching has been. Christian teaching has always said even weaker people, even servants, can sin towards in their relationships. So that is a theological discussion I'm happy to have, and sometimes that pops up here. And I think that in some ways was the discussion some people expected to have, and then it turned out there wasn't much evidence of that, and that's why we're having the discussion we're having now. So that's a little personal experience. Now let me jump forward, and I put together a little timeline just for the context of what was happening. I think the kind of the moment of all this is in 2017, Dwayne Rollins in Texas files a suit against Paul Pressler, who was a famous Southern Baptist, a force behind the conservative resurgence along with Paige Patterson. And Rollins alleges that Pressler sexually abused him for decades. And that sounded fantastic to a lot of people. People weren't sure what to make of that. But then several young men came forward and gave affidavits that told consistent stories that over a number of years, Pressler had made what amount to homosexual advances on them. And so there's 4 or 5 of those stories that come forward. And I think that really what we're talking about. You can kind of see in Texas, the lawyers there are looking for more information. They're looking for people to bring into the lawsuit. There's suspicions about the SBC. So that lawsuit gets filed in 2017, and people hear facts about Judge Pressler that shock them. And so the question is, what do we do about that? Where's that go? In 2018, we have Rachel Denhollander testify against Larry Nassar. Larry Nassar was the doctor for USA Gymnasts, and he was bringing young women into the exam room and covering them up, even when their parents were in the room and molesting them. And so Rachel Denhollander testifies. She's one of the first that comes forward and testifies against Nassar and gives a wonderful statement in her victim impact statement that says, I hope you feel the guilt of what you've done, Dr. Nassar, and that leads you to confess, and that leads you to repentance, because I forgive you, but most of all, you need Jesus' forgiveness as well. And so that puts her on the public stage all over as a good Christian response to somebody who's faced abuse but's overcome it and has forgiven her accuser. In February 2018, Denhollander tells Christianity Today she's been representing other abuse victims in evangelicalism, and it's cost her church home. She says disagreements about how Sovereign Grace Ministries responded, C.J. Mahaney responded, her local church responded. She said they were just refusing to deal with what she said was a clear, documented case of cover-up. And Dr. Mahaney was friends with Dr. Moeller and some other people active in what we might call the Young Restless Resurgence, Young Restless Reform movement. So kind of that young Calvinist movement. Denhollander is saying our pastors have not handled this well. And so in March 2018, Mahaney has to step away from T4G. He agrees not to speak. And then on May 6th, women in the convention publish an open letter concerning Paige Patterson. They say they found some old sermon clips where he objectifies young women, and they say that's inappropriate and he should be fired. And that was signed by Jen Lyle, by Beth Moore's daughter, by Matt Chandler's wife. Kind of Southern Baptist luminaries in May of 2018 are saying, hey, we got a problem with Patterson. And I think they were thinking, well, this Pressler stuff is going to come out about Patterson too. And so we need to start developing the case against both these guys to get them out of the convention. We understand that Megan Lively saw the open letter, and she calls Bruce Ashford, who is J.D. Greer's elder at his church and the provost at Southeastern, and says, hey, Patterson told me I should downplay what I think now is rape. I was raped, and Patterson said I shouldn't report that to police. So he mishandled that, and she reports. And so there's lots suddenly of coordination going on about A, what happened with Pressler and Patterson, and B, Denhollander coming forward as this voice. And so we know from the documents now released in the Sills case, May 21. So just right after the open letters published and all this coordination is going on, Lyle calls her supervisor into a meeting at Lifeway and says, here's this story about what happened with me and David Sills. And he manufactured things, and we had this long ongoing relationship. On May 22, Megan Lively, again from Southeastern, publishes her story in Washington Post the same day Paige Patterson. And as a board meeting, Southwestern demotes Patterson. Within the week, another person comes forward and says, hey, Patterson did the same thing to me and told me not to report my rape case, the famous break her down thing. And so by May 30, Patterson is fired. And is right before that, there's kind of hubbub in the convention. People know something's about to happen. And it's right during that Sills, that Lyle tells Geiger what's happening, and then Al Mohler gets a call on May 21. So Lyle goes into Geiger. Geiger immediately calls Mohler, and Mohler says, "Uh-oh, I've got this problem." And so he wants to be away from the Pressler and Patterson mess. Who does he call? He calls the person who's on the news as a good advocate, Rachel Denhollander, and says, what do I do here? And so we know Rachel Denhollander advises Mohler what to do and how to respond, and advises Lyle what to do, how to respond. And the agreement they come up with basically is, we're going to confront Sills. They go in and says, did this happen? Were you in fact sexually active outside your marriage? Yes, I was. Well, then you can't work here. You're going to resign. And from what we can tell, that's what Jen Lyle wanted to happen. Mm-hmm. And so that happens in 2018, May of 2018. And then J.D. Greer becomes president in summer 2018. So that's the run up to Lyle's report. And then you can see from there kind of what's happening in the SBC, the group motivated by Greer and Moore. At the same time, they're hearing disturbing things about Pressler. They're not sure what to think about Patterson, but they want them gone. And then suddenly, anybody that advises caution at the executive committee or wherever, they've become an advocate for abuse. And so you can tell Moore is blaming all of the pressure he's facing, any failure he has. Well, it must be because these guys are hiding abuse. And that snowballs behind the scenes for 3 years until 2019 and then the 2021 convention. So that's the background as to where we get up to what Southern does. And that's indicated in these documents have been filed. One of the most helpful documents that was filed was, in fact, folder. They've been asked to turn over their folder.
Wait, repeat that, John. You dropped out, and we were both like, "Wait, what's the most important document?"
Yeah, you glitched. You glitched at the most important.
It was Southern Seminary's legal file. So the file that Southern Seminary kept for the whole period is in chronological order, and so that was published. And so those are the notes that show what Southern does, what Southern was hearing, and that kind of gives you the context as to how this happened. So again, in 2018, Sills resigns. And then then all sorts of things start happening in the convention, right? Greer becomes president in 2018. In November 2018, the RLC conference is suddenly sexual abuse. We're going to change it because we got to do something about sexual abuse. And so you can tell they're all coordinating with Denhollander and with the Houston Chronicle and perhaps the lawyers for Pressler's accuser. Let's develop the case, because we are almost positive what we're going to find is that the SBC executive committee is the nexus. It's the hotbed of all of this. And if we can blame the SBC for all of this, then there's a huge pile of money, not just for Rollins, but for lots of victims, if we can show the SBC executive committee was the hotbed. And you can tell, at some point, that dovetails perfectly with Russ Moore's political needs, because the executive committee is kind of the old line conservative group in the SBC, and there's friction there. And so everything they do pushing back against him, he says that's because they're really covering up this evil core at the SBC executive committee. And so there's all of this plotting going on to reveal these guys are at the core of this. What can we do to investigate this? How can we put them in the worst possible position? Let's get them to waive attorney-client privilege. Let's do something at the convention to get the messengers excited so that we can blow the lid off this and prove that our convention enemies are really evil people. So all that planning is going on. November 18 is the ERLC conference. February 10, 2019, Houston Chronicle comes out with their story, and the same day, or within, or I guess within the week, February 18, J.D. Greer already has a task force appointed. He announces this curriculum coming. We've got resources because that Houston Chronicle story is a bombshell, he says.
Almost as if Greer knew the Houston Chronicle story was coming.
Almost certainly, in my mind, these people are working together and talking together about what to do next. And so all of their interests align at this point. And as Megan says, the Houston Chronicle story by itself shows that churches were passing the trash, and something I oppose, there can be things done to help and improve. But what Greer and Moore needed, and what lawyers at the time were hoping for, was that we could show it was all at the home office. The executive committee was really directing the abuse. And so they're going to push that as hard as they can. And that becomes the motivation for all of this. So February 28, 2019, Greer announces his task force. And it's within days of that, Jen Lyle writes to Dr. Moeller and says, I've recently learned that David Sills has been hired as a missionary at a third-party non-Baptist group. And now I've come to realize, she says in a letter that's in the Southern File, now I've realized that I made a mistake by doing this quietly. I wanted to protect my relationships and didn't want this to be a big deal last year. But now I realize Dr. Sills can go get a job at any other church and lie about what happened. And I don't think he should be in ministry anymore, which I think is something Megan and I would agree about. He shouldn't be in ministry anymore.
I agree with that too. Yeah.
And so she writes Dr. Moeller and says, hey, I made a mistake last year. And now talking to my counselors and lawyers, I want to come forward and say I've been abused by David Sills, not just that we had an affair. And the way I want to do that is I'm going to write up a story and have it published in Baptist Press as my own op-ed, first person article. I'm going to get that published in Baptist Press. And so she sends her statement to Baptist Press and the executive committee. And the statement includes this paragraph. She says, that day when I shared with what happened with my boss at Lifeway, and then later with Dr. Moeller, I was quick to also share responsibility I bore for being compliant at times, for not telling immediately, and so idolizing the idea of a whole family that I protected it despite what was happening within it. I am not a sinless victim, but I am a victim nonetheless. And so that causes Baptist Press and the executive committee to go, now, this is a problem. The media is saying all of this abuse is happening in the SBC, and now she wants to come use the words sexual abuse relationship, but this is not molesting a child. This is not a rape at a gunpoint, as some alleged at Southwestern or Southeastern. This is a person that says, I could have said things earlier, and I kind of feel bad that I didn't say that. And so we're going to, you can tell, and I think lawyers tend to say or feel, we want to limit sexual abuse. If we're going to label somebody a sexual abuser, that implies something about the victim not having volition, right? Not having a way out of this. And so when this person comes to us and says, I feel really bad, and I probably could have spoken up earlier, and I have some sin in this relationship as well, they're reluctant to just let her publish that in Baptist Press. Why? We don't do that for anybody. Here's my relationship in Baptist Press. So they say, well, we're not going to publish her statement. We're going to do a reported story. We're going to give it to a reporter. And the reporter then says, well, takes her statement and kind of edits it to be a reported story. And the lawyers all look at it and go, we're really uncomfortable using the word sexual abuse here, as if he held her at gunpoint or as if she were a minor over 10 years and she confesses some responsibility. So they make the edit to say, Lyle alleges a morally inappropriate relationship. and they published that story against a
With
reported story.
a quote from her. I don't remember what the quote was, but something indicating that she felt it was abusive.
Right. Yeah. Now she does use the word abuse in her initial statement, but she also says moral culpability. She says she has moral culpability, and so you can see the lawyers of the executive committee going, this is a hard one. So since she admits fault, let's say it's morally inappropriate. We don't want to label somebody a sexual abuser. He's not been found guilty. There's been no police report. All of those reasons you can see them thinking about, and they say it is, in fact, a morally inappropriate relationship. So they publish that story, and then commenters say, looks like an affair to us. Looks like she has some culpability here. Looks like this wasn't a case of sexual abuse. And that's where we start getting tension between the Baptist idea of, well, clearly Sills has abused his office. He, as a professor, as a pastor, as a missionary, has greater culpability in some. He's broken more promises to people. He's broken promises to Southern. He's broken promises to his wife. He's broken promises to his church. So clearly greater moral culpability. But we're not lawyers, and he's not been found guilty by a court. And so we're not going to use the word sexual abuse. And that, after all is said and done, once the guide, that kind of forms the basis of this complaint. But then after the Guidepost does their report and a privilege has been waived and they do all the research, they ultimately don't find any nexus to all the Pressler stuff. It looks like the executive committee was as surprised as anybody that Pressler, who wouldn't have had direct contact necessarily with the executive committee, they didn't find that. That story turned out not to hold water. And now you need some story to explain how the executive committee is still a bad guy. And this is the story they've got left. And so now it shifts from a story of, well, this is a hard decision, to, well, no, we have to adopt the essentially woke doctrine of sin, that if there's any power differential, that's automatically sexual abuse, just like child molestation or just like at gunpoint. And you can see the Baptists are really wrestling with, it's bad, shouldn't do that. Clearly, Dr. Sills did a lot of wrong here, broke lots of promises, but we're just reluctant to label that sexual abuse. And in the power games that followed, one group says, no, we have to say that's sexual abuse and treat it just like it was gunpoint or just like it was child molestation. And that becomes the drive to adopt kind of these woke premises. And without that, a lot of the folks that fell for the story, that were used by lawyers and advocates and caught up in political games, they then had to adopt the woke framing in order to justify them everything that happened before, right? They cleared out a bunch of guys, and then it turns out those guys didn't do the wrong things they thought they'd done. So now we have to make clear that this disputable thing, we all have to say that was wrong and adopt the woke framing about power differentials always being sexual abuse, just like child abuse or at a gunpoint.
Yeah, and I would say that was how this case, the Lyle case, which you had some lore there that I didn't know, John. That was really interesting. But how Rachel Den Hollander rightly said that is how the Lyle case became the linchpin of getting the Guidepost investigation approved. And one other thing I just want to quickly note about that is that they were also using it when you talk about, the woke ideology in terms of how do we view abuse when we're talking about two adults and there hasn't been force or violence or threats of violence. One of the other things that I heard repeatedly, and I, clipped some tweets and comments, and Krista Brown said several things like this, was that part of the problem, they argued, was because we don't have women in leadership, that we have this culture of abuse because we don't have women on our boards, or we don't have enough of them on our boards, or we don't have them in the pastorate. And that has caused a lack of power and therefore this culture of abuse. So it went part and parcel with, I would say, a feminist idea that we need to empower women in order to keep men from preying on them.
Yeah, John, that was a lot. Thank you. Very helpful. Obviously Jennifer Lyle she's died, right? And, one of the things that is really ugly and unfortunate about this is that individuals like Megan, John, and now I'm sure me, that we're weighing into this, being accused of sort of, dancing on this poor woman's grave, having this debate. But I just have to say that, you know what? It's your fault, Rachel Denhollander. And it's your fault, these other people who glommed onto the Jennifer Lyle case and ran with it and made her and this relationship a linchpin of what was way more than just trying to have a conversation about, can Southern Baptist Convention churches do better to prevent abuse? I mean, this is what I talked about with Willie Rice in that first podcast I had with him, which he shared this sort of startling revelation that the abuse survivor activists and communities, they didn't really care much for things like Ministry Safe, which would help the churches prevent the abuse on the front end, but we're way more on sort of the caring well, like what do we do for the survivors? And if it's not about the survivors, if it's not adopting this ideological position on it, you actually aren't doing your due diligence. I mean, it's their fault that we're having this conversation. And so Megan, I want to come back to you, particularly on this Lyle thing, which is where John sort of landed the plane. You were one of the first people publicly, not the only one, but sort of particularly with your perch at Daily Wire, with your June 2022 article and which is developed much more in a much more fulsome way in the chapter in your book, Me Too Goes to Church, to say, wait a minute, like this Lyle case, that's the linchpin for everything that's coming down the track on Southern Baptist, is not quite as clear cut as people might think it is. And then that's what we've really seen a great deal of vindication on from this document dump, these emails from Lyle to Sills and other things. So Megan, sort of tell us how, what was your reaction to that piece? What put you on to saying like, hey, wait, maybe there's more here? And then talk about some of the documents that we've seen now that is essentially bolstering the case that we're making here and others have made, that, you know what, this was highly inappropriate. It was sinful. It was wrong. But to claim this was sexual assault seems like a legal fiction.
Right. And I think part of it was because, like everyone else, when the conversation started happening, and, I came in long after some of the events that John described there. I think, my very first inkling of this is kind of a strange debate happening within my denomination that I don't pay that much attention to was in 2019 when that Founders documentary, By What Standard, came out. And I covered it at World Magazine. And at that point, I thought what a lot of other people thought, that I thought we were talking about protecting kids. And yet now everything is focused on this very murky allegation from this adult woman. And this is very confusing. So, initially when I looked at it, and I'm, doing what I do, which is clicking around social media, trying to get more information. And I saw someone ask Rachel Denhollander, what exactly does Jennifer Lyle allege that David Sills did? Specifically, I mean, what were the violent acts? Where, truly, are we talking about rape? What happened in this case? We're being asked to put these reforms into place and to approve a very expensive investigation almost entirely on the basis of this case. And you haven't told us what even she is alleging. And Rachel Denhollander replied, I am her attorney. I will ask you to desist from this line of questioning. Her case has been investigated and judged to be criminal sexual assault. I knew that wasn't true. I at least knew that much wasn't true, because I'm like, okay, wait, nobody's talked about police reports here. There's been, no sort of proper authorities investigating this. And so that was when I became interested in the case and started writing about it, because so many of our SBC leadership, including Bart Barber and others, again, said this case has been investigated by experts. And I could see no evidence that that was true. And so at that point, I went, okay, I'm watching the Guidepost report, the Guidepost investigation on Rachel's recommendation be approved. I am watching resolutions to waive privilege that Rachel helped draft also get approved through some, I would say, Hollywood machinations on the floor of the convention, where a crying survivor was brought up and, kind of presented and said, look, we need to pass this resolution to get privilege waived. And so as I was watching those things, I went, I find this story questionable to begin with, that a woman in a 12-year relationship who lived in a different state from this man and had to travel to be abused by him, I guess, that it was never consensual the entire 12 years, and nobody has even alleged specifically what he did. That made no sense. So that's when I started asking questions. And, some of the first calls that I made were to people who were on Southern Seminary campus at that time. One of them was Russell Fuller. Some others spoke on the condition of anonymity. So I talked to them on background. And what they told me was, we saw these two around campus and it looked inappropriately affectionate. Their relationship looked affectionate and loving. And to the point that, one professor told me, I assumed that they could not be having an affair because if they were, they wouldn't be that public. Guilty people wouldn't behave that affectionately publicly. And so, that reinforced my doubts. And then I interviewed Lyle, and I spoke to her in one interview for about 2 hours, and then in another interview for about another hour. And I also reviewed some interviews that she had given others. And there were details in her story that simply did not make sense and could not be made to align with reality. So things like claiming that not only she called the police, so she said, I called the Louisville police and I called the Louisville Police Department, and they said, no, sorry, we have no record of that. Nothing on a Lyle or a Sills and nothing matching that description. I called Jennifer Lyle back. She said, oh, I made a mistake. No, it was the Jeffersontown, Kentucky police. So I called the Jeffersontown, Kentucky police, no records. And then she also told me, she said in another interview with an apologetics ministry that Albert Mohler had called the Louisville police and warned them that David Sills had a gun. So, I mean, these were, the story was starting to get embroidered and there were specific details that you could check. So I assure you that if Albert Mohler had called the Louisville, Kentucky police, they would certainly have a record of that. And I did eventually connect with Dr. Mohler, who said, I didn't call the police. That didn't happen. So she also claimed that the Nashville police had been called to do wellness checks on her and drive by and see if she was okay because they were worried David Sills might come to her house. The Nashville police also had no record of it. So it was again and again, I was getting pieces of information that simply did not align with her story. And the other thing I was able to determine was definitely before Guidepost picked this up, nobody investigated it. And, eventually I was able to connect with the Sills and determined that they denied it, that inappropriate sexual activity had taken place. David Sills confessed to that, but denied being abusive and denied that it was non-consensual. So when I saw reporting, like in the religious news service from people like Bob Smiatana saying that he confessed to abuse, I knew that that wasn't true. So what I knew was that a lot of claims were being made all over the place that were not accurate. So, then I just set out to write the story and go, well, why are they pushing this thing that has so many holes in it and that makes so little sense?
And like you,
go ahead, John.
Well, like you said, William, it became the linchpin case again because I think they didn't find what they expected to find about Pressler at the executive committee, and so suddenly a case that was going to be just kind of sugar on top, right, the icing on top of the big bombshell, they didn't have the big bombshell, and then it became important that the Lyle case become a bombshell. Mm-hmm. And so it really is striking. Looking through these documents, we see Jen Lyle telling her story at different times. The earlier she tells the story, the more of a gray case it is. I think at some point she says on the initial contact with Sills, that I wasn't sure why I wanted it, and he explained it was because my family was broken. So let's admit, up front, that's gross, right? It's common in these cases where you have somebody on the prowl, they're making up terrible theological excuses, right? God wants me to do this, or we're meant to be together, or my wife is going to die soon. Or here she says, Sills is explaining, well, the reason you want all this is because your family is broken. Gross. But early on, as she's telling the story, it is, well, I'm wanting this and I don't understand why I wanted it. And then in her letters to Baptist Press, she says, I accept I've got some sin here. But then once the lawyers and the advocates and the whole weight of the Guidepost story falls on her, the lawyers are controlling the story, and it becomes increasingly the woke story of, well, I had no consent. My consent was taken away from me for a decade. And so this is clearly sexual abuse of the kind that you might find in criminal courts or in civil courts, even though she never filed a claim. So the later the story is told, the more it's obviously controlled by lawyers. Another thing that comes out in these documents is obviously Jen died young of some kind of brain hemorrhage, but as part of the testimony, she's got to list out all of the medical treatment she was undergoing at the time, including lots of experimental treatments for treatments and drugs are really meant to soften and change memory. So ketamine injections and things like that. And so that's why I think when Megan is investigating later versions of the story, there is some evidence of memory problems. Some things just aren't adding up. Some claims, Lyle claimed at one point that Dr. Moeller had told her story to the entire Great Commission Council in 2018. That would have included Augie Boto, the lawyer at the executive committee at the time. And again, going back, there was so much venom for Augie Boto amongst advocates and in the press. If they could have proved that Augie Boto knew about Jen Lyle's abuse and done nothing, that would have been the front page of the story. Absolutely, they would have said, here was proof the executive committee knew about abuse and did nothing. But it's not mentioned in the Guidepost report. Why? Probably because the best explanation I can have is probably because she was wrong about that detail. Now, it's not, always and that's why we have the trial process. There's always small errors in memory, and sometimes those are a big deal, sometimes those are not. So it's not necessarily the end of the story that somebody gets a detail wrong. But you can just tell the closer this becomes to the core of the SBC political drama and the advocates and lawyers looking for a big payout drama, the more the Lyle story has to be perfect, right? It has to be perfect. And she was all correct, and everything she said was right, and everything anybody else said had to be true and false, or had to be false, and they were bad and evil. And so the story starts losing the texture. I told somebody it's like a moralistic drama, right? It's after school special at the point the lawyers get control of the story, because nobody did anything right. Everybody else was wrong, and she was always right, even though, as Megan found out, if you went and checked the story at some points, all the facts didn't add up. And so it was important. That's why Baptists were expecting an independent investigation of these claims. And what we ultimately got was a story written by Rachel Denhollander to advocate her narrow position. Lyle's attorney and friend of many people that were now in power in the convention that have been swept in under this kind of this revolution. And so Baptists were deprived of the independent telling of the story, independent investigation that they all inspected. Why do we think they expected that? A, the motion said you're going to investigate claims of abuse and whether or not people responded appropriately. And clearly, in order to understand if the executive committee responded appropriately, most people would say, well, what do they know about the claims? And did the story add up? And did it look like what we would expect as abuse? But by that time, you couldn't risk that anyone says, well, that's a close call with the executive committee, not a big deal. It had to be a big deal. And so you had to tell the story in a way that you preserved, well, everything that's happened up till now, we got rid of the bad guys, and those are still bad guys that still need to stay out of power. When I think most people would look at that story and go, that's a close call. Maybe they could have done something different. But when somebody comes in and says, I've been abused for 12 years and I feel kind of sorry about what happened, and I'm still dealing with why I wanted to do some of the things that I shouldn't have done. And then most people would say, and you're the editor of a Southern Baptist Convention's largest publishing resource. You're engaged in theology. And so whatever flimsy, gross excuse some old man gives you, we still expect adults who exercise volition to know they can't engage in sexual conduct with somebody else's spouse, somebody who's not their spouse. And early on, you see Lyle wrestling with that. But then as it becomes a political bombshell and a big moneymaker for others, that has to go. And so the story gets flattened out to lose all of that color.
Yeah. And I would say in the executive committee's defense on, publishing it the way they did, I at one point went, why did they just not publish it? Because it was such a murky allegation. And then I thought, well, it was at the height of the Me Too movement, and they had these abuse activists I think haranguing them is a little bit fair to say. I think had they not published it, they could have been accused of silencing victims. So they were very much in a no-win situation, as far as I can see, as whether to publish her claims or not publish her claims.
Oh, and I would agree. You don't want David Sills getting new jobs at new churches if
Right.
he's not telling the truth, right? So you don't want him back out of the mission field. That's a
But-
good reason to say something.
Right. And I would say that saying that he had committed sexual sins should do that job. You should not be able to get these jobs simply by the fact of you are an adulterer and therefore you are disqualified. The problem was once you label someone an abuse victim or an abuser publicly, now you have very likely disqualified them from getting most any job, whether in ministry or anywhere else. And that to me was part of what I thought was unjust, because I think absolutely, you should face the consequences for your sexual infidelity. Yes. And that includes you don't get to work in ministry, but it could also mean you now can't be hired anywhere because you are not just a man who cheated. You are a man who abused.
Yeah. Okay. So this has been a lot, guys. I want to try to get us as the Sherpa of this conversation. Want to get us to some because want to get us to some of the cash out from these documents. And I want us to try to place some blame as much as we can, because, John, you're saying things like the lawyers and the people looking for payouts. It's like, well, these people have names, right? The people who foisted all of this on us as Southern Baptists, who destroyed other good men along the way in their quest for this, they have names. So I think one of the things that is very obvious, at least to me, from the documents that have been released, Megan, the ones you've shared, John's the ones you've shared, there's more, is that the Lyle case, this idea that she was a completely non-consensual participant in a 12-year affair is beyond, it's untenable. And so for a lawyer to be advocating that was 100% the case seems to me to be like legal malpractice. But some of the documents that reveal this most clearly are her email interchanges, right? We got to see all these email interchanges between her and Sills, which are quite something to read. And I didn't enjoy reading any single one of them that I did. But another big thing that came out of this, and I want us to get to this, is that we were promised the Southern Baptist an independent third-party investigation, independent.
Right.
And Rachel Denhollander and even Lyle herself got to make edits to the final guidepost report before it was released. Did I get that right? Is that what we learned from this document dump?
Yeah, David Sills hired an expert to look at what Guidepost did and write an assessment. Did this comply with the normal standards of an independent investigation? Now, granted, that's an expert witness, and they're paid for to do their work, and that's normal. So it is obviously somebody supporting David Sills' position. But as I think shocked even Baptist News Global, not a conservative bastion in Baptist life. When it came down to it, when push comes to shove, when Guidepost is asked, but did you investigate these Sills claims at all? The answer was no. We took everybody else's word for it. And they try to blame Dr. Moeller. Well, he said it was abuse, so it must have been abuse. But really, it's Lyle's advocate, Denhollander, who's making sure that is the claim going forward. So again, at the point the story changes from it's going to be a big dump on the executive committee as this cauldron of abuse, like Russell Moore said in his hidden letters in 2020 and 2021, the investigation doesn't bear that out. And so then suddenly all of the incentives align. Folks that wanted to destroy the convention, well, let's not destroy it yet. But folks that were out to get the convention or continue to press legal claims or representing victims, there needed to be defense. And so part of the untold story at the RLC still is there was a companion Bankert motion that was supposed to bring in the guys from Grace, Boz Shavidian's group, which is very opinionated in a particular direction, but they were truly independent. And so you can see Rachel Denhollander working behind the scenes. Well, we got to get rid of Grace. Grace has to go. And so that dies at the RLC. The RLC changes the tune and says, we need to do a big investigation with Grace. Now we're not going to do that. So they're gone because they would have they would have laid blame across the board. And Rachel didn't want that. And the new folks didn't want that. So we have to write this report super carefully so that it makes a big deal about what the past guys did, even if the new guys did some of those same things at their own churches. So we have to write it that way, but we also have to make sure it protects the new guys. And so suddenly the incentives are all different, and it's impossible to be the representative of abuse victims, abuse advocates, the convention leadership, her own personal clients. I don't understand how at that point there wasn't an overwhelming conflict of interest. And then we find out in these documents that Rachel Denhollander, either with Lyle directly or on her behalf, is editing the final report so that it makes the case in the way particular people want it to be made, depriving Southern Baptists of the independent investigation they thought they were getting.
Well, they didn't have an independent investigation even before that, because they brought in Samantha Kilpatrick, Rachel Denhollander's co-writer on the Caring Well curriculum and good friend, to be the primary investigator on Guideposts' behalf. And this was a woman who had already told Lyle before she was appointed to the investigation. She emailed her and said, "I admire your courage. I believe you," and encouraged her about, how admirable she found her actions. So you had an investigator from Guidepost who had already made up her mind about the things she was investigating.
And you can see people starting to get placed at these major groups in anticipation of reports that are going to be written, because people want to control the story from outside. And so Guidepost hires a Southern Seminary graduate suddenly. They'd never done that before, as if they were going to be writing a report. And Kilpatrick, who was a friend of Denhollander, was in North Carolina, had gone to these conferences and been working with victims. She was suddenly hired by Grace, Boz Shavidian's outfit. And I think that was in anticipation of her writing the report for Grace at ERLC. But when ERLC kills it at Grace, and then victims complain, "Hey, Kilpatrick mishandled a case at our church." They had some complaints about how she'd handled it in the past. Grace fires Kilpatrick. And suddenly she's hired by Guidepost to be the lead investigator and write the Baptist report. So there's this really weird placement already, questions about, well, how did these people get picked to write the report? And was it advocates picking who was going to write the report, not independently? And
the answer is yes.
Yes.
The answer is yes.
I think the answer is yes.
Right. And so Kilpatrick, Denhollander, at the absolute nexus of this, given essentially the pen, with a massive conflict of interest, particularly as Denhollander is representing Lyle to determine the outcome and the wording and the presentation of a so-called third-party investigation to tell Southern Baptists who we are and what we've done with abuse and survivors and covering things up. And it's not like our leadership didn't know this, right? So one of the emails that you see in that dump is some correspondence with Litton, and you get to see some of these depositions or these interviews too. And it's like, Litton knew Denhollander had a conflict of interest, and he was the one, was it Greer or Litton, whichever one, appointed her anyway.
Litton appointed her, even though she was Denhollander's lawyer, that she was a known abuse activist, anti-abuse activist. Rachel was wearing the hat of advising Southern how to handle Lyle case, then becoming Lyle's lawyer against the executive committee, then being appointed to advise the task force, then also working on Guideposts' behalf as the person that abuse victims who called the hotline were referred to. And also in private texts that were leaked, she admitted she was helping those people who called the hotline get in touch with lawyers to further sue the SBC.
And remember, as near as we can tell, she helped Grant Gaines draft the initial motion.
That's right.
So
she
tells the messengers what to do.
Which JD Greer was absolutely working on as well behind the scenes, and had the coordination between Greer and Gaines to get that across the finish line at that annual meeting.
And then think of the issues that come up. Should the convention waive attorney-client privilege? Yes, she's going to advise, yes, they should. The task force is going to sign the contract with Guidepost. And remember, there were debates. Should we do a initially confidential report, let Guidepost investigate, but not publish it? Well, some people didn't want that. So she advises, or ultimately the task force comes out and says, no, we want a public report. Well, Guidepost says, well, we won't publish the report unless you agree to pay all of our legal fees if it gets messed up. Who would the task force have asked for advice? Their advisor.
Rachel.
So the advisor would have said, no, you want to go ahead and promise to pay their legal fees if they ever get sued. So is that in the convention's best interest? Absolutely not. Absolutely not in their interest to go sign an indemnification agreement for a group that's never done such a report, where it's not apparently independent, where they don't know what they're doing. And so she's advising the task force to take steps that really hurt the convention down the road, because frankly, now the expense, a lot of the 12, 13, 14, $15 million that's gone out the door is the convention paying to defend Guideposts and paying their lawyers because of complaints about how Guideposts did the work. And so those decisions, the advice Rachel was giving, really are key to how this whole thing unfolded.
John, can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, William. I have to ask this.
Go for it.
Does the Southern Baptist Convention have any recourse in terms of the conflict of interest that was employed to get this very expensive service from Guidepost, given that their task force advisor was encouraging them to do things that would be damaging to the Southern Baptist Convention, but good for Guidepost?
Hard to say. I think probably so. The one piece we don't kind of know is that the ethics rules do say, now, if the lawyer advises kind of all of these various interest groups that there are potential conflicts, sometimes those groups, if they're fully informed, can sign a waiver. And so I'm not sure what background work was done to say, hey, look, there's a bunch of conflicts of interest here, and do you all agree I can do this anyway? I've heard that doesn't exist, but I don't know that for sure. And there was some other footwork there. So I can't tell if the line was crossed, but I can tell you who would know, and that's the lawyers for the SBC Executive Committee. And if they know that there were conflict of interests that harmed the convention, then they could certainly come either as the Executive Committee or the SBC to the SBC and say, hey, we've incurred liability here or damages because of unethical conflicts of interests. And at that point, they may have some ethical obligations themselves to report. The state ethics codes usually say if a lawyer knows there have been certain breaches, then they have to be reported. Again, we don't have kind of the final missing pieces, but there are people in the SBC that do. And I think that'll be something to watch if they decide there were conflicts that ended up damaging different groups.
Okay, so to try to summarize this is when you can. This is not a statement of legal record, but just to try to summarize this, the initial, because I think a lot of Southern Baptists today think of this primarily in terms of the expenditures, the outputs over the last few years. The executive committee coming to Southern Baptists saying, we're out of money. We need to get this money from here or move this money here because of our legal fees. We're selling our building. We're selling the headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention. And there's no way it is not related to the legal expenditures due to the litigation resulting from the Guidepost Solutions report. And John, just real quick, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the main two lawsuits that are costing the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee, which is fundamentally spending our tithe dollars, is the Sill suit and the Hunt suit. Is that correct?
Those are the most expensive, and there's a third one, Garner, in the Tennessee courts.
That's right. The guy who got thrown under the bus, accused of being an abuser. He's like, I never was. Right. So those are the two ones. So before we get into that litigation where the executive committee, because of Rachel's advice, indemnified Guidepost and took on the legal responsibilities of this biased cooked report that they were going to release. What were the expenditures before we get into the Sills and Hunts? I mean, we're talking a couple $1 million, maybe whatever we spent on the report and things like that. It wasn't the 15 million. Like, I mean, that's to me, I would love to know that. And maybe one of you two do, or we can find it afterwards. It's like, at some point, we're working on a little graph of, we spent a couple $1 million on this, and then we hit the litigation and it takes the L curve.
Well, I mean, there are obviously big costs after 2021 when the convention says we're going to do an investigation, we're going to waive attorney-client privilege, we're going to bring in a bunch of lawyers to go through 20 years of documents and assess those. So they start incurring big costs with the report, and I think you're right. It was in the single millions range, and then the report comes out and lawsuits are filed, and now we've got really lengthy. There are 400 or 500 docket entries, 400 or 500 filings in the Sills case alone, and each of them have 5 or 10 lawyers on them. And just, you just multiply by the hour, those are huge numbers.
So sort of the summary cash out, and then chime in on this, is that because of Rachel Denhollander and her advice and role between Lyle and the executive committee and everything else, and her role in the Guidepost investigations report, her conflicts of interest, and all the advice that she has given us and we've taken, we, at the end of the day, produced a report that primarily focused on 2 consensual affairs between adults who both turned around and sued us because of essentially the characterization of their behavior in it. And now we are $15 million in the hole later because of this. Am I getting close to accurate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's the upshot. And we actually didn't even talk about the fact that, yeah, so, one of the big pieces of evidence in this document dump was the emails from Lyle to Sills, in which she says she misses him and longs to be with him and has nightmares about him ending the relationship. So that kind of put a pin in the question of, was it ever consensual? Because I think when you're sending emails like that, it seems pretty evident that, yes, there was at least something consensual going on in this relationship. And same thing with, the Hunt case. You had an accuser who was in her mid-30s and didn't realize it was abuse until 10 years of therapy. So I would say, yes, that is the summary of it.
Yeah, I don't want to let off the hook those that turned theological convention politics in order to get rid of their enemies, in order to get new jobs, in order to gain power. They turned over the convention to woke ideologues. So everyone who was pushing for waiving attorney-client privilege, everyone who was pushing to indemnify Guidepost, everyone that was looking to make things as bad as they possibly could for the executive committee for personal political reasons. And there were lots of people engaged in that, right? There was kind of the younger crowd was anxious to get rid of the old Bethencourt, Moore, Greer, Gaines, Parrott, all of that crowd. They turned over the convention to the dogs in essence, in order to get rid of their enemies. And then when they were in power, then they engaged in more chicanery to try to protect themselves and end up producing kind of this botched report. So who's to blame behind all that? Is it the person they trusted? Is it the people that came up with the plan? There are lots of folks that, for political reasons in the convention, cost offering plate money, hurt missionaries, hurt missions, wanted to give the convention a black eye so they could get better jobs. There is a lot of blame to go around in this situation.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's Rachel Denhollander and her enablers. I mean, just listen to you guys. And I don't have a personal bone to pick with Rachel. I don't know her. I've maybe crossed swords with her husband once or twice on X, but it's her story, her personal story before all this, good for her and everything she did there. But it to me, the cash out value really sounds like we opened the door and let Rachel Denhollander walk in and control this entire thing for years, because and the men in charge of the Southern Baptist Convention at this time, Greer, Moore, Litton, Barber, who has repeatedly gone out there publicly and said, oh, this was all investigated, this was all proven, this was all corroborated. Oh, wait a minute, here you are under oath, Barber, giving us a little bit of a different tune on these things. The Southern Baptist Convention presidents, commit, they let her, as a bull in the china shop, to try to pick off their enemies. And so let me run this theory by you. I mean, and it's kind of hard to parse this, but it seems to me that it would be crazy to say that in no way, shape, or form was there a cabal of left-leaning actors in the Southern Baptist Convention who essentially embarked upon a liberal resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention using a variety of different wedge issues, including racial wokeness and other things, political wokeness, Trump era, but really the claim of there being an abuse crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention that we had to, take the flamethrower to, for the sake of our name, and I guess for Jesus's name as well. They used this to purge the last remnants of the conservative resurgence and take power in the Southern Baptist Convention. Am I anywhere close here? You guys can both disagree with me on that, but that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, no, I think the temptation was what Rachel was promising was, if you do everything I say, I can get rid of your enemies and I can get you a new reputation with abuse advocates, and they'll forgive you. There will be peace in the valley if you just do what I say. And that she couldn't produce because of ethical conflicts, because of conflicts of interest, because of the various competing issues. What we have at the end of the day is $12 million flushed, no independent report. There are still folks angry at the Southern Baptist Convention, and we didn't buy peace. So the temptation, what they were tempted to go for, she couldn't produce and hasn't produced, and it won't be produced. And until we really turn our back on that whole attempt, the SBC will kind of continue to flounder around and bleed money.
Yeah, and one of the things that was shocking to me about that ethics report was the question of whether it was even legal for Guidepost to conduct it in Tennessee at all. I mean, the most basic of baseline questions that this ethics investigator, who you're an attorney, John, so you'll tell me, but you seem like a very competent attorney, said they didn't have legal standing to do what they did in this investigation at all, and ultimately called it malpractice.
Yeah, I mean, there are various fights about, do you have to get a license, even if they require you to get a license? But all goes to show this was not Guidepost normal area. Guidepost, in essence, was taking the word of others about what to say and do. And again, at the end of the day, we've got this pile of, was any of this legal? Was any of it correct? Was any of it done to ethical standards? Again, it's David Still's expert witness, but she raises very credible points, regardless of why she's saying it. She's alerting us to very important facts that indicate this wasn't done properly.
If I'm an average Southern Baptist pastor, I'm just furious, right? I mean, it seems like, and this really, I mean, we can talk about the racial stuff, and that was nonsense, and maybe we'll purge DEI and anti-white racism out of the SBC. Everything else Megan's shown in her book, climate change silliness, the ERLC and the evangelical immigration table, Russell Moore's liberal political leanings. You put all that aside, honestly, it doesn't, to me, as just like a Southern Baptist, it pales in comparison to this 6-year, $15 million at least operation that has been run on us as a convention that has hurt churches. I mean, that has hurt our name and our standing in the eyes of the watching world. It has cost a lot of good people their reputations. Mike Stone, Tom Buck, Tom Maskell, Rod Martin, Ronnie Floyd, has helped a lot of bad actors. I mean, to me, this is like the biggest crime against the Southern Baptist Convention in the last 6 years. And I would just be, if I'm listening to this as a regular Southern Baptist pastor, I'm pretty mad.
Yeah, I mean, I've had questions that, given what Guidepost admits under oath in this lawsuit, that they did not investigate Sills's claims, that they didn't even try to contact him, that they did not include people who were within the purview of their investigation, people like Frank Page, I think that's who it was, that he was not included, even though he should have been, based on his actions and his relationship with the executive committee. On the other hand, they inserted things like Paul Pressler that was not within the scope of their investigation. I mean, I kind of have the question, is it possible for Southern Baptists to somehow get their money back in some way from Guidepost for what's clearly an investigation that wasn't an investigation.
You would need either the executive committee or the convention messengers to be willing to do something about it. So could they? Probably yes. Will they? I don't know. Obviously, the current executive committee, I don't know, has the appetite for that. Would messengers have the appetite for that? I don't know. But I think those are absolutely legitimate questions that when a firm knows it's supposed to be producing an independent investigation and you yet hires writers that have been placed and lets particular victim advocates write portions of the report, didn't they know they weren't doing their job? And so those are certainly questions you could investigate if you had the will to do it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, in just like one sentence, this Guidepost investigation and report was not independent. It was rigged. It was biased. It was rigged. And the pen was given to Rachel and her cadre of enablers to yield a specific outcome. And that outcome took us to court. Okay, so what do we do? We've been going for almost an hour and a half here. What do we do, John? Meg, I mean, we're all Southern Baptists here. We all go to different Southern Baptist churches. Maybe we'll all be messengers in Orlando. I mean, I will, John will. Maybe Megan, you can be a messenger in Orlando this year. That'd be fun. But what do Southern Baptists do? In terms of fixing the leadership issue, accountability going forward. We've talked a little bit about the potential to recoup our losses. Oh, just brainstorming session here. What do we tell Southern Baptist pastors to do about this?
I mean, mine is one, send messengers. Two, I really want to encourage people. What I was tearing my hair out about when it was going down in 2022 is that, even as a lay person, I could sit back and go, there are obviously claims and narratives being run here that aren't accurate. And they're obviously being run for a particular reason. People are trying to grasp power. They're trying to put into place these new bureaucracies that didn't exist anymore, that would give centralized power over local churches. And I had issues with that. And so, my first thing would be, I just want to school people that I understand it's scary when suddenly you see the name of your denomination splashed across the New York Times and the Washington Post and on CNN, but you need to take a minute and think that, typically bad actors will manufacture and use crises in order to get their reforms enacted. So, that is my biggest message is, hey, when you see those things happening, just stop. Nothing does have to happen immediately. We could actually take a minute and think about this rationally. And I wish people had. So, send messengers to Orlando. And then I am in the place right now that I actually think Guidepost and Rachel Den Hollanders, who I'm more interested in than, all of the sort of salacious stuff with Sills and Lyle. I'm interested in the fact that we paid a lot of money for an independent investigation that was neither independent nor an investigation. So, I would like to see some ramifications for that. If Rachel Den Hollander did, if there were no waivers and these were deliberate ethical breaches or even, breaches committed in ignorance, I think there needs to be some accountability for that as well. So I would like to see some movement in that direction from some leadership.
Yeah. I mean, from the convention, from the perspective of a Baptist who wants the SBC to work and to be healthy, and that's, what all of us at CBL have always wanted. We have to see truth from our leaders, right? We cannot put people in place that continue to have the wrong instincts, to continue to tell lies. I'd like to see some apologies about, now that I've seen the facts, I realize I was caught up in something. I signed letters that I probably shouldn't have signed. I was caught up in the moment too. That seems to be the minimum. And we've seen folks like Willie Rice willing to say, I was caught up in some of this, and I realized it was going in the wrong direction. That's the minimum. We have so many people in conventional leadership still that want to say, well, let's let bygones be bygones and not think too hard about what happened there. In order to be, if the SBC wants to move forward in a healthy direction, it has to have people who are willing to deal with the truth. And if you made mistakes, to admit your own mistakes. That seems to be rule number one, job number one of the messengers in Orlando is to make sure you're putting people in place that are going to tell you the truth and not hand over the convention to woke ideologues in order to score some political points. We have to get rid of that kind of leadership and replace it with folks that are trustworthy.
Yeah, I mean, we've said something like this before, but I'll go ahead and make it maybe in the strongest case that I've done before. But I think we need essentially a wholesale leadership change at the executive committee. I mean, and it'd be great to get somebody like Willie Rice as the next president of the Southern Baptist Convention. But if you're listening to this and you haven't thought through this yet, just let me remind you that the deep state of the Southern Baptist Convention is the executive committee, which is run by somebody who is elected to serve in a completely non-tenured, well, that's not the right word, non-time limited position, right? So, Jeff Orge is in there right now, and he could be in there for the next 10 years as we cycle through, 5 different rounds of 2-year SBC presidents. And just from a bureaucratic, analysis, that gives the executive committee a lot of power. They can wait out the president if they don't like them. And I think we need, as Southern Baptist, to get a new president and CEO of the executive committee who's going to be willing to essentially investigate the investigators, open the books, tell the truths, demand apologies where necessary, cut our losses where we can. I mean, John, I haven't, what are we even still doing? I mean, I would say Center for Baptist Leadership, you and others were pretty instrumental in getting the Josh Wester proposal of this semi-independent agency to continue the abuse stuff killed. But they're still doing stuff, right? We're still pouring money into it. It's like, what does it look like to just cut it all off, end it? I mean, should we settle these cases? Should we just settle with Sills and Hunt? Like what's your take on that?
Oh, that's above my pay grade. I don't.
Okay.
Obviously, there's still lots under seal. I don't know kind of all the arguments that are being made there, and obviously, we hope the case is resolved. Right? If something's been done wrong to Dr. Sills, if he's not been treated honestly, despite the things he admits doing, we still owe it to everybody, no matter their past, to be honest and not lie about them in the future. So if that's been done, then that's what the courts are there to sort out. Everyone wants to see the convention in a place where it's not caught up in litigation and it's standing for the gospel, and money isn't going towards these lawsuits, it's going to missions. How do we get there? Again, I think key number one is let's get leaders willing to tell the truth and deal honestly with the convention itself.
Yeah, well said. Megan, last words?
No, I agree. I mean, I couldn't say it better than John just did. So, yeah, I would like new and honest leadership. And frankly, it does feel like we need something like a new conservative resurgence.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, wholeheartedly. I mean, and I do think that this has to be, so if you're listening to this, it's so hard. People are like, what can I do? Well, anybody who is aspiring to any position in the Southern Baptist Convention, even trustees, we need to get way more focused on the names being put up for trustees at our entities. Do you believe with do you believe the Denhollander line, or do you think we made a mistake? So if there is anybody out there who's going to come and run for SBC president, that's not Willie Rice, that maybe signed letters encouraging the executive committee to waive attorney-client privilege, those individuals need to, I think, be ready to have an answer for why they defend that in light of all the facts. And this too, let me say this too. These guys love to not look at the evidence, right? So it's like they love to just say, well, I didn't know it at the time and I don't really pay attention now. It's like that your ignorance is not an excuse anymore.
Right.
You can listen to this podcast. You can read Megan's book. You can read the Twitter. You can go look at the documents. Ignorance is not an excuse. If you still think that it's 2019 in the Southern Baptist Convention, you are fundamentally unfit for any future leadership. I'll close it at that.
No, I agree. And that, half of how we got in this problem was, things like SBC presidents tweeting that people were violent sexual abusers without actually having any proof or evidence of that. So it'd be great if they stopped doing things like that. Yeah,
for sure. So, well, Megan, John, thank you so much. Really hope this is helpful for individuals. Where would you guys, if you wanted to help people kind of get a little bit more familiarity even beyond this hour and a half, where would you send people? I know John Harris has an article he's published on a Substack.
Yeah.
Megan, you also talked to John Harris as well, but John Whitehead, Megan, where can people go do their due diligence?
Not to plug my book, but in Shepherds for Sale, I dedicate a chapter to the subject of abuse, and much of it goes into this Southern Baptist mess. And my original 2022 Daily Wire article dove deep into what I knew at the time. Obviously, we have new information now that, and all it has done is support what I wrote then. So you can go and find that article. And if you come find me on X at Meg Basham, I've been posting screenshots, excerpts from a lot of these documents, and you can find them there.
Yeah, actually, Megan, before we go, just indulge me with just a couple more minutes here. The reaction you've gotten from a certain cadre of activists on X has been insane. And I have most of these people blocked, and it makes my life better. But, whether it's Janet Mefford, Blake Callens, Julie Roy's, the Ministry Watch people, they seem entirely committed to this narrative. So have you been surprised at the blowback and the reaction from them? Any comments on that to defend your honor here?
Thanks for asking. Mostly I would just say what has been most shocking to me about all of them is that they have no interest in the actual documents and evidence coming out of discovery in this case. So we now have the number one bombshell piece of information to me coming out of the discovery documents in the Sills case is that clearly Jennifer Lyle was in a consensual relationship with David Sills. And they have ignored those pieces of evidence entirely. They don't want to talk about those emails because what those emails do is show that the entire narrative on which the abuse crisis was built was never legitimate to begin with. So they're not talking about that. They are also not talking about Guidepost admitting under oath that they didn't investigate the case and that they didn't invest other things that they certainly should have investigated under the parameters of what they were hired to do. So those are the things that probably have been most shocking to me is that, they want to argue with me about how I went about collecting my evidence. And that's fine. If you want to do that, I'm happy to have that debate. But I don't think whether or not I told someone a story about, something that happened in my childhood that was true is quite as relevant as Guidepost admitting under oath that they didn't investigate anything. So, that's been amusing to me.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there we go. We just got our best clip of this whole conversation right there. So thank you for that, Megan. John, resource recommendations, average Southern Baptist pastor, what can they do here?
Obviously CBL has published a number of things over the years about, the controversy. I guess if folks want to take a look at these documents themselves, I think that is, we talk about the magistrate being beneficial, a minister of God. And it's been good, I think, for Southern Baptists to be able to see these documents, which we would not have gotten through the trustee system. We would have not gotten through church courts. And perhaps it's good to recognize courts are good at this. And there's a reason churches aren't in the competition with your local civil court. We just don't have the resources to get all these documents. I will tweet, and I'm sure CBL can repost kind of a link directly to the court lister archive where lots of these documents are publicly available. What is publicly available seems to mostly have been downloaded, and you can look at it yourself. Like I said, I thought the Southern file that got published as an exhibit, document 457, exhibit 13. I'll post a link to that as well. I just think those are really helpful at giving the context to what was going on, so you can make up your own mind about these issues.
Okay. Yeah. And hopefully we will have some, I've been traveling and, John is busy with lots of other things, but maybe we'll get something together here we can put out at Center for Baptist Leadership here too before the end of the year. But so much more could be said. Let's go ahead and leave it there. We both have families. We all have families and dinner times to get to. Megan and John, thank you so much. And really from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of all the good faith conservative Southern Baptists out there, thank you to both of you for the slings and arrows that you've been willing to take, for the name calling and the reputational damage, if it exists, for defending the truth and defending the interests of good faith Southern Baptists. We're here because fundamentally we believe the Southern Baptist Convention is a force for good. It's a force for gospel good. There are so many good churches, so many good pastors. And it would be a real shame here if, continuing on into the 21st century, the main thing Southern Baptists are associated with is this political hatchet job trying to destroy our reputations and benefit some very particular people. So thank you guys for the work that you've done.
Thank you. And back at you. Thank you for the work that CBL does. It's very much appreciated.
Great. All right, guys, I'm gonna play us out here, and you guys have a good day.
You too.
If it loads, hold on a second. But you gotta load the closer. There we go.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.